guys. Now, obviously, since I'm out this whole week, I'm not going to have your tests graded. I will not get those graded until I'm back the next week. So you'll have to wait a little bit to see how you did on that test. But today we're going to get started into the next chapter. So if you haven't already, I'm going to put 30 seconds up on the board so you can get a daily question sheet, because we're still going to be doing those this week, and get situated. We'll do the daily objective, and then we'll kind of get into some notes. We're going to have to start with some notes today. So get those things prepared. I'll put a little bit of time up on the board for you to take care of that. We're going to do something slightly different to start today. I've got this worksheet 4.1. On here are some questions that are going to deal with what we talk about today. But instead of going through all the information and having you fill that out afterwards, I actually want you to try to fill it in before we go over the information. And then we'll go back and see how well you did based on your prior knowledge. So I'm going to put 10 minutes up on the board. That should be enough time to hand it out, to look over the questions and fill in what you think are the correct answers. Then we'll actually go through the lecture and talk about the information. And at the end, we'll come back and see how you did. So we define a rock as a natural, solid mixture of minerals. So that might be something you want to write down. Okay, we studied minerals in the last chapter, and we talked about how minerals are naturally occurring and how they are solid pieces, and we talked about some of the other things that make up a mineral. And so a rock is really just a mixture of minerals, but those minerals can be mixed together in a bunch of different ways. So I have to look at some of the characteristics of those rocks when we start looking at the different kinds. So a rock is basically just a bunch of minerals mixed together. Now when we look at rocks, we see that they have different grains. So a grain is just the fragment of the minerals that make a rock up. We'll look at that in just a minute. So the minerals that go into making up the rock are going to be in little pieces. And we can look at those different grains and how they're arranged to tell different rocks apart. So these are the two main things that we want to kind of look at as far as minerals and how they make up rocks. That they're a mixture and that those minerals are going to be in certain fragments. Let's take a look at a couple of different rocks and look at their grains. So here we have two different types of rocks. I forget what the one on the left is. The one on the right is a form of granite. But here we can see that they're both mixtures of minerals. Each of these little pieces is going to be a different mineral. We talked about the different minerals that make up the granite. But we can see here there's a big difference between the grain size. In this rock type here, we can see that the grains are pretty big. And in fact, they look like little rocks themselves all pushed together. And that's going to be a characteristic of one of the types of rocks that we're going to study. In the granite, over here, the mineral pieces, the grains are much smaller. And so this has much more of a kind of a throughout composition where the little pieces are kind of more mixed together and they're not such big chunks. And that's really the biggest difference between the grains of a mineral. Really the size of them is going to kind of help you look at what type of mineral it is. So what we've just been looking at is called the texture. The texture is the grain size, but not just the grain size, also how it fits together. Write that down, and then we'll go back and take a look at the pictures and talk about some of the characteristics of that texture. Okay, so if we look here, this rock on the left has a much bigger grain size, but also the way that they're put together, and it has to do with the size. They're just kind of all jumbled together, and they're filled in between with a different type of mineral. So this, it's more like, we've got this one type of mineral, and in between cementing them together is a different type. Whereas the granite, these things are the minerals here are much more evenly mixed. If we look at a section of the granite right here, they kind of flow all together, they're mixed together, and it's spotty, and you can tell where the different minerals are, but it's not as, it's not as obvious that you have one mineral and another one filling in between. These are kind of more evenly mixed together. So both of those things have to do with the texture, the size of those chunks, those grains, but also how they flow and move and get put together when the rock is actually formed. So texture is a pretty important characteristic of rocks, but we also have the composition. Composition really is just the types of minerals that you find in the rocks. So we looked at different types of minerals last week in the last chapter, and we know that those minerals can be mixed up in different ways to make rocks. And some rocks may be made of the same type of mineral, but they might be put together in different ratios. For example, one rock might have a lot more feldspar than silicate. And in another rock, those things are swapped. And those could be different rocks, even though they're made of the two same things, just because one rock has more of one thing and another rock has more of another. So the composition really just talks about, when we look at composition of rocks, what minerals are there. And so those two things are going to be the main things that geologists use to classify and tell different rocks apart. The minerals that are there, so the composition, and then the texture. And of course, texture has those two components, the grain size and also the distribution of those grains. So composition and texture, those are the things that are going to be used to figure out what type of rock you are looking at. And it's not an easy thing. I'm not really good at telling different rocks apart. It's kind of hard. You have to really know what you're doing to be able to look at those compositions and those textures. And a lot of times the composition is hard. It's hard to look at a rock, just look at it, go, oh, I know that there is this element in there, or this mineral. So in a lot of cases, the composition is going to be a little bit hard to determine unless you're able to do some sort of chemistry, some sort of chemical analysis to figure out what actually makes that rock up. When we look at composition and we look at texture, it turns out that most rocks can be easily classified into 3 different categories. Now, we're going to learn that these different categories also deal with how those rocks are formed. So write these down. These are our 3 categories of rocks. We have igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. So the main thing that's going to set these 3 different types of rocks apart is how the rocks are actually formed. Okay? It turns out that there's a whole rock cycle, and we'll be learning about that tomorrow, of how rocks are made and reformed and remade. And so even rocks, we think of rocks as being these things that last forever, like mountains and that kind of stuff. But as we'll find out when we look at the actual length of time that the Earth has been around, these things are always changing, just like everything. So igneous rocks are going to be formed from cooling lava or magma. Okay, and as we've sort of talked about before, the only difference between lava and magma is if you're finding it above ground or below ground. So when you have magma that bubbles up from the hot part of the Earth, and it gets to a place where it cools off, it's going to form a rock. And depending on the types of minerals that are there, it's going to form, a certain type of rock. But all of those rocks would be classified as igneous. So igneous basically means that it's cooled from molten lava or molten magma. Sedimentary rocks are formed from compaction of fragments. So wind and water and glaciers and all those kinds of things, those weathering things, can actually break off small bits of rock, and they can grind off pieces of rock and sand. And when those layers of rock and sand, tiny little pieces of rock and sand, get built up, and they over many years they can compact and they can get squeezed together to form a new type of rock, which is called sedimentary rock. Some sedimentary rock, like limestone, actually has little pieces of ancient animals and plants embedded in it. So these types of rocks are just made from squeezing or compaction of lots of little pieces together until it hardens and forms a rock. And then our final type of rock is called metamorphic. So metamorphic rock is interesting in that it is formed from changes to other rock caused by heat, pressure, and sometimes fluids. So if igneous rock or sedimentary rock gets into a place in the earth where it can have lots of heat and pressure on it, and sometimes fluids that are moving in, you can have those types of rock actually change. There can be chemical processes that change the type of rock, the sedimentary or the igneous rock. It'll change the composition and the makeup of those minerals, and it'll turn it into a whole different kind of rock. And that's what we call metamorphic rocks. So those are going to be a little bit interesting and a little bit hard to understand how they can actually form compared to the other two types of rocks. Now we're going to study each of these types of rocks more in depth next week, starting this week and next week. But we just want to know the overall types of rocks right now. Now that we've gone through all the information, I want you to go back and look through your answers and see what you need to change. So I'm going to put 2 minutes up on the board. That should be enough time to kind of look over stuff, change what you need to. There's space underneath if you need to cross something out and write it in. And then I'll put the answers up so you can check them. Okay, next we're going to watch a small video that's going to talk about those different types of rocks and just kind of give you more of an overview of them. And then we'll come back and I've got something to pass out, and then we'll do the question of the day. So hopefully that video gave you more of an insight into the 3 different types of rocks and kind of give you some examples of them. Next, what I would like you to do is get a copy of the new vocabulary sheet. So I'm going to put a minute up on the board. That should be enough time to get these passed out so that everybody's got one, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Okay, so everybody should have a vocabulary sheet, and if you look at this, there's a lot more words on here than previous vocabularies. So this one's going to be a little bit tougher. And that last one, even though there wasn't a lot of words, we still had people that got quite a few wrong. So I think we're going to need to spend a little bit more time studying over these vocabulary words. You're going to really need to be able to focus on some of the words that are very similar. For example, we've got biochemical rock, chemical rock, clastic rock, foliated rock, intrusive rock. So those would be easy to get mixed up. We're really going to have to focus on the differences between them. Okay, I'm going to put up the question of the day here in a minute, but first I want to tell you a couple things. First of all, we're going to skip homework for tomorrow. We will have a couple other homework assignments towards the end of the week that I'll check when I get back, but for right now, we'll kind of just let that slide. But for tomorrow, what we're doing tomorrow in class, you need to make sure that you bring your book. So try to remember, and I'll try to put out a remind in the morning to help you remember, but you want to have your books, because the thing that we're going to do in class, you're going to be using a page out of the book. So make sure you bring it. So here's your question of the day. Make sure you fill that out, hand it in.